Welcome to this edition of the South Shore Press podcast. I'm News Director Stefan Mihailu, joined by Joseph Burns, very prominent attorney in New York State and Republican circles, really across the country. And Joe, your expertise, correct me if I'm wrong, is on election law in New York State. You know it like the back of your hand, correct?
I know a few things about it.
Oh, you're being humble. You're being humble. I'll brag for you. Joe is like one of the best, smartest, in addition to being a great guy, just a great legal mind when it comes to all things boards of election. You're currently an attorney. And I wanted to start on a story that we featured heavily in the South Shore Press, and that is multiple legal challenges to RFK Jr.'s candidacy to get on the ballot in New York State. And I want you to break it down or help our listeners really break it down from a legal perspective on the mechanics of it. What is it? So let's just start with the lawsuit itself that you actually share with me, the one filed in State Supreme Court, Dutchess County against RFK as running mate and the Board of Elections. So it appears as though one of the big challenges is residency. The lawsuit claims that RFK lives with his actress wife, Cheryl Hines, in California, and is using a dummy address in New York State. What's the crux of the legal argument there? And is there really a legal leg to stand on to toss him from the ballot in that respect?
So today is the 11th of June. This lawsuit was filed just yesterday, the 10th of June. And today, the 11th, is the last day. It's the last day for somebody to file a lawsuit to invalidate an independent nominating petition, which is what RFK Jr. And his running mate filed to be on what he's calling the We the People party line in New York. So you're right. The biggest piece of the argument and the petitioners, the plaintiffs, are four voters in New York State who have filed objections, general and specific objections against the petition of RFK and his running mate. They're the plaintiffs in this proceeding. But like you said, the biggest element in their argument, their biggest argument, is that he, on his petition, claims that he is a registered resident and registered to vote at this address in New York, when in fact he and his wife, a very famous actress, Cheryl Hines, they actually reside at a home in Southern California. And the argument that's being made is that this is fraud. He doesn't actually live at this address. He's never actually lived at this New York address. It's actually the home of a couple that are longtime friends of his, and he is using this address illegally for these political purposes. Now, go ahead.
But you know the law, though. I mean, is it in a little ambiguous in New York State on where you could actually say, like, this is my domicile, this is my home? Does RFK have like a little bit of legal wiggle room here to say, sure, I can use that house?
Right or wrong, the concept of residency has been expanded greatly by the state legislature and by the courts over the decade. You can, there are many instances of this where individuals may spend 11 months of the year at one home. They may commute to work from that home. They might spend virtually every night at that home, but they claim a second residence, a summer home that maybe they only go to for 1 month a year. They would then go and claim that is their residence. And for the most part, that's been acceptable. The courts have accepted that. Here's another big issue that I see with this argument against Robert Kennedy, is that you don't even need to be a registered voter to run for president. There's nothing that says you have to be a registered voter to run for president. Let's see, you've got to be 35 years old. You've got to be a citizen from birth. had to have been a resident of the U.S. for some number of years. He meets those qualifications. There's nothing. Where do we get these qualifications from? The U.S. Constitution. There's nothing in there about being a registered voter. You don't have to be a registered voter. So this is where this is what I think is likely a very big Achilles heel in this argument. That let's say the plaintiffs, the petitioners, are correct that this is a sham. He doesn't actually live at this New York residence. Therefore, his registration is bad. Well, so what? You don't need to be a registered voter to run for president. The issue, in connection with this issue, in the lawsuit, it's been raised that if Kennedy were in fact a California resident, his running mate is also a California resident. Well, that could present a problem under the 12th Amendment. What's that problem? If the president and vice presidential candidates are from a residence of the same state, and they win that state, the electors from that state can't vote for both of them. That, however, so that would be a problem, but let's understand what would have to happen for that to be a problem. They would have to win.
State of California.
And they would have, right, they would have to win the state of California, which, I'm going to be honest, is probably pretty unlikely that a third-party candidate wins the state of California. That, however, so yes, there's an impediment there to the electors from California voting for both of them if they're both California residents. But that's not an impediment to Kennedy getting on the ballot in New York. That's an impediment to the electors after the election potentially voting for them.
So, do you think then that him listing the New York residents has more to do with the 57 electoral college votes in California rather than saying, sure, I have this house in the People's Republic of New York? Does it seem as though that's really what his play here is?
I'm actually not sure. All I can think of is that he did, as I understand it, spend, I don't think there's any question that he spent the vast majority of his life, and certainly his adult life, in New York. He was involved with river keepers. He was a professor or an adjunct professor at Pace University Law School. And maybe most notably, his father was a U.S. Senator from New York. So I don't know if maybe that was behind him being registered to vote, being a resident of New York. I'm not entirely sure. And certainly the issue with the vice president, I believe she's only been his running mate now for a month or two at the most. So I think this decision was made long before he chose her, and certainly before this issue of the California electors being able to vote for both of them would have come
up.
The
lawsuit now, I think the lawsuit now seems to have some teeth when it comes to signatures in the petition process. Can you take us through, for people who may not be familiar with it, how incredibly challenging and difficult it is for someone like RFK, who's not affiliated with a political party, to gather tens of thousands of signatures of registered voters in New York State to qualify for the presidential ballot?
Yeah, it's a heavy lift, and it actually became a heavier lift in 2020, or I should say after 2020. Prior to 2020, for an independent candidate for president to get on the ballot, he or she would have needed to get 15,000 signatures, including 100 from each of half of the congressional districts in the state. In 2020, that was raised to 45,000, so more than double. That was raised to 45,000, with 500 coming from each of half of the congressional districts in the state. That's a really heavy lift, and by comparison, other independent candidates in 2020 seeking the presidency, seeking independent lines, Cornel West, Jill Stein, both running as independent candidates. The parties, in the case of Dr. Stein, she's a Green, but the Green Party is no longer a recognized party in New York. Both of their petitions preliminarily have been ruled invalid by the State Board of Elections. Now, when the State Board of Elections will officially act on that on Thursday, but as I see it, they have not filed enough signatures, and I don't really see where they would have an argument in court to get back on the ballot. So Kennedy filed over, I believe, 100,000 signatures when he needed 45,000. This lawsuit is arguing fraud. And by the way, I should note it's been reported that he was paying petition circulators up to $90 an hour to collect signatures.
That's crazy. I would collect signatures.
That's a big number. That's a big number, certainly.
I have 3 young kids at home for diapers and milk and things like that. I'll carry for $90.
That's what's been reported out there. $90 an hour.
But Joe, when you hire someone though, like I go back to the state of Michigan, I was involved in the primary for governor. We were behind a candidate, and like 2 of the top contenders did the same exact thing. They hired some outside group to go and get their petitions, and it was a disaster. It was a train wreck. Fraud. They signed the petitions themselves. They didn't check registrations. And the 2 top candidates in the GOP primary for governor of Michigan got tossed from the ballot. So it sounds like RFK may have made the same exact mistake of hiring a company like this, and they're not reputable, and they may not know exactly the specific petition process in New York.
That's it's certainly a possibility, and the objections were filed, and you really have to look at this as 2 tracks. There's the filing of the objections with the State Board of Elections, and the board will make their determinations on the validity or invalidity of the objections, and the validity or invalidity of the petition. And then there's also, you might look at the second track being the judicial track. And so the objectors have filed their lawsuit in Supreme Court in Dutchess County. Now, it's interesting, you mentioned the issue of fraud. You could only prove that, the Board of Elections will not make any judgments on fraud. For the objector, you can only win on that in court, in Supreme Court, which of course in New York is our main trial court. You can only win on that issue of fraud in Supreme Court, but it's not easy. And there's certainly a lot. I read the plaintiff's papers. There's certainly a lot that they've thrown at this, but fraud is hard to prove. Number one, and I would also note that under our civil practice law and rules, if you're arguing fraud, you have to plead it with specificity. There are allegations that are made against the RFK petition. There are allegations about some things that circulators may or may not have done. Have they met the burden of pleading fraud with specificity? Have the objectors, the plaintiffs, have they met that burden? I'm not entirely sure. I mean, that's going to be certainly going to be up to the judge to determine. And if I were in RFK's shoes, I would certainly be arguing that they haven't pled fraud with specificity. But from what I've seen, I think they're going to need a bit more than what they have argued, and it made some citations to some newspaper reports, other media reports. Honestly, to survive that, to have actually made those fraud arguments properly, I think they probably are going to need more than what they've argued so far.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Now let's talk about
if I could just interrupt you.
Yeah, of course, Joe.
Of course. That shows you some of, that right there is a great example of, you always hear about the complexity in New York election law and how it's no place for beginners, and there are all these traps that a beginner or an amateur can fall into. That's a great example where you might think you have a great argument about fraud. You may think you have your opponent dead to rights, but you have a very short statute of limitations. number one. So there's really not much time to correct anything you've gotten wrong. By the time you've discovered you've gotten something wrong or misstated something or not stated something clearly, you're probably outside the statute of limitations. And in this case, like I said, have the objectors, have the petitioners properly pled fraud with specificity? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, it's going to be up to the courts and not the Board of Elections, which makes it quite interesting. But let's talk about the lawsuit itself. Multiple media outlets, including the South Shore Press, of course, are talking about the fact that there is a belief that the Democratic National Committee had, basically found voters and say, "Hey, can we put your name on this lawsuit?" As a former elected official, I've been sued in my capacity, politically, from a government perspective, and I always find it interesting when I look at, okay, who's suing me? Who are these people? And of course, in my case, I'm a Republican, and it was people who were controlled by the local Democratic Party. You say, "Hey, you're a committee member for the Democrats. I need you to put your name on this lawsuit." So, Joe, can you just talk about, and I'm talking 30,000 foot view here, Joe, not like the specifics of this specific case, the 30,000 foot view here. Isn't it common for like the Democratic National Committee to find party loyalists, committee members, and say, "Hey, you're putting this name on this lawsuit because we need to have a registered voter on the suit itself"?
It certainly wouldn't shock me if that's where these folks came from. I find it highly unlikely that these were just four individuals who asked the Board of Elections for copies of the RFK petition, and in their free time, maybe over over the weekend, they just decided to take a really close look at it, and once they did, they determined that, darn, they need to go file an objection. It's just the right thing to do. And then follow that up by all finding the same attorney and hiring him to file this lawsuit. I find that very, very unlikely.
We're going to save democracy.
And honestly, there have been media reports about how there's Democratic National Committee personnel that have been tasked, that have been assigned to challenge RFK Jr.'s candidacy in states where he's seeking to get on the ballot. So it certainly wouldn't. I don't recognize the names of any of the objectors. I think I saw that you had some folks from downstate and some folks from the Albany area. I don't know if I saw anyone from any other parts of the state. So I didn't recognize any of those names, and even the attorneys that were involved. It's a fairly small number of men and women that practice in this field in New York State, and I didn't notice the names of either of the attorneys for the objectors, but I think it's a pretty safe assumption that it's pretty safe to assume that there were certainly higher ups in the Democratic apparatus that instigated these objections and instigated this lawsuit.
Yeah, I can't imagine some concerned citizens just hanging out, having a cup of coffee. Whoa, did you see these petitions? Good gravy. We're going to protect the election integrity. We're going to make sure these elections are safe, and we're going to sue RFK. I mean, doesn't that basically go to the point of, and again, these are published media reports. I'm not talking out of school here, and again, including in the South Shore Press, how a lot of the actions against RFK have been instigated by the Democratic National Committee. I mean, what are they afraid of? Why not have this guy on the ballot and let people choose? Let Joe Biden make his argument of why he should be commander in chief. Let Donald Trump and let RFK. Why not? Why would the DNC go to these lengths and file suit like this?
Yeah, I guess I can only assume that they think that his presence on the ballot would hurt Joe Biden's reelection chances. And honestly, I think if you go back, you probably we could probably find in the past similar type challenges to Jill Stein's candidacy I know she ran in 2016 as the Green Party candidate. I think you go further back and probably see similar style challenges to Ralph Nader's multiple candidacies as the Green candidate for president. I think honestly you could even go back as far as I believe it was 1976 when the Carter campaign tried to keep Senator Eugene McCarthy off a number of state ballots as an independent candidate. So I think there's certainly a bit of a history of this when the Democratic leadership feels that they're threatened by another candidate who would be left of center. I think maybe now, certainly RFK Jr. is a pretty high-profile independent candidate, and I don't think anybody can deny he has an awfully famous name as well. So maybe that's why it's just drawing more attention from the higher ups, the grand poobahs, and the Democratic apparatus.
And aren't states different too, Joe? And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going from memory here. Certain states, like I believe it's New Hampshire, you can pay X amount of dollars and you're on the presidential ballot. That's it. No questions asked. Whereas other states like New York, it requires a very extensive petition process, and it varies state to state, does it not?
Right. Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, every 50 states, 50 different ballot access processes. Some are relatively easy, might require little more than signing a form or getting a small handful of signatures. Other states like New York, and I don't know if New York is I don't think it's fair to say New York is the hardest state to get on the ballot as an independent candidate for president, but if it's not the hardest, it's probably the among the top two or three hardest in the country. In some states, I believe Kennedy will appear on the ballot as the nominee of some minor parties, very small minor parties, but parties that have ballot access in those states. I believe I heard in Michigan he's going to be the nominee of the Natural Law Party, which I think has been mostly defunct, but I believe it was centered around practices like transcendental meditation and certain other uh, new age forms of living, I guess you might
You're being
say.
kind.
I, I, I think I saw in another state or two he was going to be the nominee of the old Reform Party, which came out of the Ross Perot movement in the 90s. So yeah, there are different methods. Some are hard, some are easy, some require you. Some would have the candidates running as an independent. Some the candidates might be running as someone like RFK might be running as the nominee of a minor party. But yeah, different methods for getting on the ballot in all 50 states.
But it's not just him, though. It's not just independent candidates. I mean, I served as spokesman for Vivek Ramaswamy. I was the deputy comms director for the campaign. I remember like the state of Virginia. I mean, and we were a national presidential campaign affiliated with a national Republican Party. And it was hard getting Vivek on the ballot in that state. I mean, we literally ran right up to the deadline because just like in New York for the independent nominating petitions, you had to get in certain, like I believe it was like state house districts signatures and delegates, and I mean it is not easy, regardless of who you are, whether you are a big shot candidate or an independent person, to get on the ballot in all 50 states. I mean,
Right?
is it not easy from your perspective?
Yeah, it's certainly complicated, and you certainly want to have good, competent, talented people who know this area behind you. Because it certainly, just take New York as an example. Just take the New York Republican presidential nominating rules. It they've changed over the years. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when in New York the candidates for the Republican nomination would have to go out and petition in the wintertime, and they would have you'd be petitioning for individual delegates being pledged to that candidate. And so if you were the campaign that had support among Republican members of Congress, Republican state senators, Republican state assemblymen, big names. You'd want to line them up because when voters saw the ballot on primary day, they would actually be voting for those individuals. So better to have a high-profile Republican congressman pledged to your candidate than just some Joe Sixpack. That
Right.
was the theory. And so, yeah, I'm old enough to remember when that was the practice in New York. Today, any candidate in New York, taking New York as an example, any candidate that can claim to be a nationally known Republican candidate for president got a spot on the Republican primary ballot, including, as you know, Vivek Ramaswamy.
Vivek, yeah. And he was still on the ballot, even
Yeah,
though
he was on the
he had
ballot.
dropped
Yeah, that's
out
right.
after Iowa. Joe, any closing thoughts specifically on, what you think? Again, it's so hard to ask. Okay, what's your crystal ball? What do you think's going to happen? But just let's close on just your thoughts, not a prediction, but just like your general thoughts on the RFK lawsuit and what happens next.
I think it's certainly going to be fun to watch. The judge is holding a conference with the attorneys on Friday, initial conference before they get into any arguments, any trial, any motions, what have you. I will make a prediction, though. I will go out on the limb and say, based on what I've seen, based on what I've seen alleged so far, if I were betting, I would probably bet on Kennedy being able to stay on the ballot. And now that I say that, I'm going to have to go find a spatula just in case I need to take the egg off my face at some point in the future.
No, I mean, I look, if it's my gut feeling as well. I am not an election lawyer. I ran for office successfully as the Erie County Comptroller for 9 years, 3 separate terms. And look, I mean, I think my gut feeling is it's going to be very difficult for a judge to say, okay, the laws are so lenient and lax about where he lives. We'll give him a pass on there, for the good of democracy and giving people a choice, and they should have a choice. Yeah, they were deficient, but we're still going to keep him on the ballot, and that's best for democracy. It really is. Let people choose when it comes to Joe Biden or RFK on the Democratic side, at least. And obviously, look, I make no bones about being a huge Donald Trump supporter. So,
and I see the biggest issue that I'm seeing with the argument is that even if they're correct that he's not a resident of New York, he shouldn't be registered at this home in New York, he's actually a California resident, that even if they're correct, I guess I go back to, so what? You don't even need to be a registered voter to run for president. Now, I think they're trying to claim that this was an effort to defraud the people that signed his petition. That's a pretty heavy lift for that argument, and they haven't produced any affidavits. They haven't produced really anything of a voter saying, "Well, I looked at the petition. It said he was a New York resident. Now I'm told he's not. Well, I want my signature back." That's a really tough argument to. I think they have a very tough argument to make. I think it's going to be very difficult to win on that.
Yeah, I don't see many New York voters saying, I've seen Cheryl Hines and she's a Hollywood movie star. He lives in California. I want my signature back. And yeah, he committed fraud. I mean, it just seems ridiculous. But hey, we live in a litigious society.
And like I noted, the idea of residency has been really liberalized by the state legislature and the courts over the year. Maybe he went and maybe this is this couple in New York who are friends of his. Maybe he happens to stay at their home when he's traveling in New York. I don't know what the circumstances are. if they're willing to both say, this couple, if they're willing to say, yeah, no, Kennedy lives here. Yeah, we got a great big house, and yeah, he lives here. Again, the idea of residency has been really broad and really liberalized. Uh, Again, if I'm betting, I think at this point I'm betting on Kennedy staying on the ballot.
We shall see. All right, Joe. It's always good catching up with you. We really appreciate your columns in the South Shore Press, which you can visit us online at southshorepress.com. Greatly appreciate you joining us. It's always good to catch up with you. We greatly appreciate your legal and electoral insights.
Thanks for having me. This was great.